Sir Kenneth, I found that was like a summary of my dietetic career in a talk, the conflict of trying to encourage people to eat healthily while recognising that you don't have the option of not eating. It's essential, it's fun, we use it as a social medium. Have you any advice on how we get that balance of not becoming that negative nanny state in terms of what not to do, but actually managing to create a more positive culture in relationship with healthier eating and food?
I mean, I think this is, in fact, really very difficult. And I suspect it's at the heart of this meeting. How do you make that change in people? I mentioned a couple of ways. One is role models. And some role models really can change people. The stories that people tell and the stories that they can use to change others, again, very important. This is the contagious theory of behavior change. Tell the right story and things will change. But I think people have to recognize that it's difficult just to tell people to stop eating or do something different. Don't buy all of these cheap foods and sugar-filled food. To do that actually is a negative thing to do. So we need positive stories. You could feel better, you could do more, you could enjoy life more if you lost weight, if you make sure that the food you eat is good for you. And it's the positive stories rather than the negative ones. That's why I think the Cancer Research UK, Obesity Causes Cancer, is an extraordinarily negative statement. And if you were a bit overweight, you might say, well, I don't know whether I like that.
Thank you. I see up on our screen we've already got a couple of questions coming through. So the first one is really, you mentioned about you've lost weight through using a smaller plate and portion size. And I know that we've seen that coming through as a suggestion in the obesity strategy, but Scots are very much fond of having a good deal. And eating out is seen as a treat, and meal deals and larger portion sizes are often seen as good value. What would you see we could do to change that out-of-home eating environment?
I mean, I think it's quite difficult because when I am out eating out, as I often do, and say I'll have 2 starters, the rest of the people around the table look at me as if I was funny. And I think, what's wrong with him? He just wants 2 starters, surely he must. But it's quite interesting to watch people's reaction to that. And people go out because they want a big meal. They quite like a meeting. And I like my food too. But that restriction, I think, begins to make a difference, and did make a difference for me, for example, because I was overweight and I didn't like it. It's quite difficult for the chief medical officer to be a wee fat person and smoking cigarettes, you know.
Interestingly, when I was working as a dietitian, quite a few of us were overweight, and I think it was because we entered the profession with a love of food. So we're very sympathetic and empathetic to the challenges of trying to modify your eating habits and to give up or reduce the consumption of foods that you love. And it is trying to find that positive reason for change. We've also got a question about, over the length of your career, the perception of what is considered normal in terms of body image has changed. What do you think would be an acceptable change for us, not to be going towards the model thin, but equally trying to reduce this? It's almost become normal to see very obese images on television and places. You talked about role models.
I mean, it's quite interesting to look back. One of my tasks is to chair the National Library of Scotland. I'm going to a board meeting in a moment or two. But we've got in the Kelvin Hall in Glasgow, if you haven't been to see it, the Moving Image Archive. It's fascinating to look back at films in the 1940s and 50s of Glasgow, for example. And the wee kids are slim. They sometimes don't have shoes on, but that's another matter. But you can actually physically watch the change. It's a lovely film I saw recently. This is the 70th anniversary of the National Health Service this year. A lovely film of a hospital ward somewhere. And the nurses look different. So things have changed. And I think if people recognize that if you do become obese, then it restricts your life in a number of ways. There's some things you can't do as well, particularly exercise and dancing, you know. I quite like Strictly Come Dancing now, as some of you will know. You know, when I dance with my daughter, it's easier now than it was a year ago.
Yes. Well, we can't maybe all sign up for Strictly Come Dancing, so that's, because I do think that would be a great motivator to lose the weight.
Well, I've actually written to them to say, I went to see her in the Kelvin Hall. There were 10,000 people in the Kelvin Hall, lots of young people watching and enjoying this enormous dancing experience. What a wonderful way to get children and young people involved in terms of dancing as another option.
Another option for those that are maybe not so keen on sport. There is this thing about the balance between nanny state and actually having an interventionist approach. And it is difficult sometimes to get that balance right. Have you got any advice for us on how not to come across as being the nanny state, but still to achieve the interventions that we need to?
I think the only thing I can think of is to use positive stories rather than negative ones. You know, eat too much and you'll get fat and horrible. It's not a good way of doing it. Why don't you lose some weight and feel better? So I think it's that, and it's a very difficult balance, that. And it's interesting, I look back at the paper I wrote. I mean, it's in 2009's Public Health, just the end of the nanny state, I think it's called. It's very interesting to look back, and indeed what's changed. And I think the Scottish Government, for example, in terms of cigarette smoking, has been very positive about things, and things have begun to change, which is tremendous. But it is very much a balance. But if you make it very negative, the messages, then you'll switch people off.
There's an interesting question come up about, should we be talking more about the actual nutrient content in the diet and the things that are missing, like fibre, vitamin D, other minerals, or is it better to just talk about the overall diet and getting a balance in that?
I think there's a part of the problem, I think, is reading the little bits in your food as to what they actually mean and what you're looking for. I can now find the kilocalories quite easily, but I would have difficulty with some of the others. So I think it is important, I think, to think not just about sugar, but actually all the other things that are there, and the things like fibre, which are good for you, and other things that you can change. And perhaps we should be saying more about the good foods that there are. I mean, fruit, for example, vegetables, for example, the good foods they are, rather than talking about the bad foods. Again, it's just a perception of the good stories or the bad stories.
It's interesting that you've raised that. We've got a question that's actually talking about the calorie labelling on foods, but we obviously can't do that. We don't do it at the moment on fresh food or food, takeaway foods, etc. Do you think it would be useful to introduce some calorie labelling that might help influence choice in takeaways, etc.?
Well, I mean, I think this goes back to the nanny state again. And if I said to my local Indian, you must always say how many calories there are, then I don't think that would go down terribly well. On the other hand, it's terribly important. And interesting, if I just talk about my Indian food, which I love, when the family get together for that, I don't have any at all. I just eat from their plates. Because I can't cope with a big plate of it now. So they don't get me one, and I just take everybody else's. And it's cheaper that way, but but I enjoy that food so much, as I don't want not to have it. But I'm slightly funny that way, and my family think I'm a bit stupid.
But it's also very good that you're taking care of your family's health and reducing their calorie intake too, so it's a real positive.
Yes, that's right.
I think it's a very positive thing to do. Health inequalities has been a major issue, and I've spent most of my career looking at it and not seen much change. Do you think that we're at risk of broadening the health inequalities gap by trying to address the obesity, or is there some way we could minimise potential impact on that?
Well, all of the evidence suggests that there is a difference in social terms between those who've got a little bit of money and those who don't have any much money. And that difference really makes, and is very obvious in terms of obesity. And I gave some data there. I think getting rid of the inequalities means thinking not just about food, but in economic terms and in social terms. Jobs, education, these things are the things that matter. And if we only think about the nutrition, we've missed a bit of a point. Harry Burns was a particular interest in inequalities, as indeed I've always had too, and it's fascinating to watch how these inequalities remain in spite of all the things that have happened over the last 50 years.
and they've got such a long-term effect, generations of change required, really.
Well, the one that interested me was one that I mentioned, that people whose mothers are obese are likely to be more obese too, and that's not an infective thing, that's a thing about how you eat.
You mentioned role models earlier on, and do you have a view on the role of health professionals, for example, GPs and others, in promoting a healthy diet and behaviour change towards a healthier eating habit?
Oh yes, I mean, I think it's absolutely critical that the health professionals have thought about this too, because they are role models, and if you're in a ward somewhere and people are looking after you, it's quite important that you see within their own lifestyle that it makes a difference, and that they've listened to the messages. If my GP hasn't listened to the messages, then why should I?
I think that's an interesting point. We're going to have to wind up, I'm afraid. You have another commitment that you have to head off to, and we have to keep going. But could I ask you all to join me in thanking Sir Kenneth for his thought-provoking. So thank you very much. It was lovely to see you again.